Imagine for a moment that the U.S. and Mexico went to war. And this is something we've never seen before in history. The United States going to war against a neighboring country. In this video, we're going to answer some important questions. How would Mexico defend itself against the U.S.? What weapons would they use? Would they be able to win? Let's find out. But first, hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any new videos. The Mexican army consists of 346,000 active soldiers. That's 9 times less than the U.S. Army. But it's not all bad news for Mexico. When it comes to tanks, the Mexican army has 732 armored vehicles compared to the 10,000 or so that the U.S. has. So that gives Mexico a slight advantage over the U.S. when it comes to the number of tanks. The ratio of tanks per 1,000 people is 6.1 for Mexico and only 3.1 for the U.S. What about aircraft? Well, there are some good news and bad news here. The bad news is that the Mexican Air Force only has 180 aircraft while the U.S. has more than 5,000. On the other hand, the Mexican Air Force has 30 attack helicopters, whereas the U.S. has only 160. So, if we were to look at it this way, the Mexicans have a pretty decent attack helicopter-to-plane ratio of 1:1. So, in terms of raw numbers, Mexico is inferior to the United States. They have fewer soldiers, fewer planes, but more tanks. However, wars aren't just decided by how many tanks, soldiers, and planes each side has. There are other important factors that come into play, such as terrain, strategy, and technology. For example, Mexico's geography makes it difficult for the U.S. to invade and occupy. It's mountainous, and its jungles are some of the most impenetrable in the world. Add to that the fact that Mexico is hot, very hot, and the U.S. troops would find themselves melting away from the heat long before they get close to the center of the country. On the other hand, Mexico would have a hard time fighting the U.S. in an urban environment. Most of Mexico's major cities are located near the border with the United States, which means that if the U.S. were to take these cities, it would severely limit Mexico's ability to wage war. The only places left for Mexico to fight from would be the mountainous and jungle regions of the country, which are not ideal for conventional warfare. This puts Mexico at a disadvantage because it would be forced to fight a defensive war, which is much more difficult than an offensive one. The reason for this is that when you're defending your territory, you have to worry about protecting your own people and your own infrastructure. When you're attacking, on the other hand, you can focus all of your efforts on destroying the enemy. Another disadvantage of fighting a defensive war is that you have to deal with the logistics of supplying your troops. When you're attacking, you can simply bring supplies with you as you go. When you're defending, on the other hand, you have to set up an entire supply chain to keep your troops fed and equipped. This is extremely difficult to do, especially if you're under attack. Another factor that would likely play a role in this war is public opinion. The U.S. and Mexico have a long history together, and many Americans have family members who are Mexican or have lived in Mexico. The same is true of many Mexicans. If these two countries went to war, it would be a humanitarian disaster. Millions of people would be killed or injured, not to mention the economic impact. So the question is, would the American people support a war with Mexico? And how about the Mexicans? Will they accept the invasion of their country, even if it's not really a popular choice? If you think about it, the U.S. might not want to start a war with Mexico because of the backlash they would receive from the rest of the world. Do you remember the war in Afghanistan? Even though it was a terrible tragedy for the Afghans, it wasn't really reported in the media. Why? Because it just wasn't that interesting to the average American. However, if the U.S. were to start a war with Mexico, that would be a different story altogether. It would be impossible for the mainstream media to ignore what was happening next door. So the U.S. would have to be prepared for some serious blowback if it started a war with Mexico. So let's say the war still happens despite all the objections. What weapons would the Mexican military use to fight the U.S.? We already mentioned that Mexico has more tanks and attack helicopters than the U.S., but what about ground forces? What kind of weapons would be used by the infantry? The Mexican Army uses a variety of light weapons, including the G-36 assault rifle and the M4 carbine. These are both very effective weapons and would give the Mexican soldiers an edge in close-quarters combat. However, the U.S. military also has access to some very advanced weaponry, including the M16A2 rifle and the M249 Squad automatic weapon. So, it's not clear who would have the advantage in terms of firepower. What about air power? As we mentioned earlier, the Mexican Air Force has a small but modern fleet of aircraft. However, they would be at a distinct disadvantage against the U.S. Air Force. The U.S. has some of the most advanced fighter jets in the world, including the F-22 Raptor and the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. In addition, the U.S. has a large fleet of drones which can be used for surveillance or to carry out strikes. So, it's likely that the Mexican Air Force would be quickly overwhelmed. And this means that the Mexican Army would have to rely primarily on its ground forces to defend against a U.S. invasion. Now, this is where things start to get interesting. As we mentioned earlier, the Mexican Army has a larger force of tanks and armored vehicles than the U.S. This gives them a significant advantage on the battlefield since tanks are so effective at breaking through enemy lines. Additionally, the Mexican Army has a greater number of anti-tank weapons than the U.S., meaning that they would be able to defend against any armored assaults. So, could Mexico actually win this war? The answer is probably not. Despite their geographical and numerical advantages, the Mexican Army is simply too small to effectively defend its borders. Eventually, the U.S. would be able to overwhelm their defenses and push them back. Furthermore, the U.S. has a much larger economy than Mexico, meaning that they could sustain the war effort for longer. Eventually, this would take a toll on the Mexican people and their government would be forced to seek a peace agreement. In conclusion, a war between the U.S. and Mexico would be disastrous for both countries. While Mexico has some advantages over the U.S. in terms of geography and weaponry, ultimately it would not be enough to win the war. The U.S. is simply too powerful militarily and economically. However, if the U.S. were to start this war, they would definitely face fierce resistance from the Mexican people. But now we want to hear from you. What do you think? Could Mexico really defeat the U.S. in a war? Or is this just wishful thinking on their part? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and share this video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.